Asuyuti.
We. Ganche. Sagoli.
Uki. Koete Hopa.
Colamalsi.
Dante.
Ani. Tanse. Sagon.
Scano. Buju.
White.
All right, welcome everyone. Hello, my name is Nadine and I am with the Stories team. For those who do not know us, we are working with Greg from ENVPMS to bring you this amazing webinar series. So today we are gathered to listen to a very important topic. And before I hand over to Greg and our amazing speaker, I would love to go through a few house rules, get a little bit of a check-in to find out where everyone is dialing in from today, and then we'll get ready to go. So if you give me one moment, please. All right.
Asuyuti.
So we have about an hour plus together. We want to make sure that we've got enough space for people to ask questions. So make sure that if you are going to ask any questions, try to keep them brief. We would love to see all of your beautiful faces so that we can all connect and engage with one another. So please, if you are comfortable, have your cameras on. I will also ask that we all stay on mute while the speakers are presenting. And if you've got any questions, any reflections, you can put that in the chat as well. And Wahida will be opening the floor later on for the Q&A. And of course, I ask that we all respect that this is a shared space for knowledge and sharing and connecting. So I would recommend and ask you, please, not to do any kind of solicitation. All right, so if I can ask everyone to bring out their phones, and we would love to hear where you are dialing in from, which communities are joining us today. We've had over 50 communities, as you've seen in the video, so we'd love to see some new names popping up there. If you cannot scan the QR code, my colleague Mariam will also put in a link that you can look at, and I'm going to share my screen and see the results so that we can all look together. 1 second. So we're here. Present. All right. I do see some new names. That's wonderful. Amazing. Perfect. And I do see some familiar communities as well. That's beautiful. Perfect. All right. So I do not want to delay us any further. What I'm going to be doing is, first of all, welcoming you all. And I will be back on screen in a bit to give you a bit more about ENVPMS and the amazing things we have planned, as this is the final installment of the webinar series for this year. But we are coming back in 2026 with new interesting things. So I will stop sharing now and I will hand over to Greg. to introduce our speaker. Greg, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Nadine. Hi, folks. Greg Philliban here. I'm founder and CEO of Environmental Project Management Solutions. It's truly an honor today to be sharing this space with you. When I first founded this company way back in 2005, my vision was, and still is, simple: to empower Indigenous communities to protect the land and secure it for sustainable future. Over the past 15 years, we have worked with over 170 communities, impacting the lives of, we've estimated, around 480,000 community members. This webinar series is dedicated to create a space to connect, exchange ideas, and to celebrate the leaders who are transforming the way project management is being done across communities across Canada. I would like to introduce you to our speaker today. I'm honored to welcome Tyler Sack. Tyler Sack is Director of Aquatic Resources and Fisheries Management with the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq. Tyler has built a respected career leading governance and resource management initiatives that connect Mi'kmaq principles with modern project management practices. He's recognized nationally through leadership, fellowship, and his work across housing, governance, and fisheries brings a unique perspective on this topic for today. So please welcome Tyler. So Tyler, you've spent years leading fisheries and resource management programs across Mi'kmaq, grounded in both science and Mi'kmaq principles. Can you start by sharing a bit about your journey? What led you into this work and what drives your passion for it today?
Thank you, Greg, for that generous introduction. So my story goes back to childhood. So my background and education is in sociology. So I was originally, my education, I never thought I would end up in natural resources or aquatics or fisheries and anything of that sort. That wasn't on the career plan initially, but 1999, there was a high profile case involving a very prominent Mi'kmaq leader, Donald Marshall Jr. And what started there was a conversation with my grandfather at the time of like, why are these people upset? Referring to fishermen in Esconobedich or Burn Church, New Brunswick at the time. What he shared with me was like an overview and education of what are treaty rights and what are Aboriginal rights at the time, and what Junior's story was. And he was basically caught fishing eels out of season and charged with that and defended and stood on, no, he has a treaty right to commercially catch and sell eels to support his livelihood. Went to the Supreme Court and he won, as we all know. And then since then, the Supreme Court of Canada dropped a ruling that we're still having issues defining and implementing of what is meant by a moderate livelihood. And then there's the question of what does co-management look like with different orders of government, including First Nations or Indigenous Mi'kmaq government, as well as what do we do with the historical injustices where our rights were not recognized or affirmed? What do we do in those instances when we were marginalized or removed from something we had a title and a right to the entire time? Our nation being the original stewards of this land for over 15,000 years is what the latest archaeology says in Burt, Nova Scotia. So that idea of taking back what was taken away from our people is what drove me into the career I found myself in today.
Awesome. That's inspirational. So from an early age, you were drawn to this issue by the sound of it.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
So UNDRIP means different things to different people. So United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. From your experience, what does it truly mean now that it's part of Canadian federal law? And how should communities and project partners interpret it in practical terms, not just the theory of it all?
Right. So my familiarity with the declaration has been theoretical for the most part in my academic studies, and it wasn't until the federal government of Canada moved away from, well, for a long time, the United Nations had always been a supporter in adopting the declaration. 4 countries had been long time holdouts that included Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and Canada. What those countries have in common is that they're settler colonial nations, and they had basically, by adopting the declaration, having to contend with and reconcile the history of how did they get title in the first place. So having to look at and examine and open up again the doctrine of discovery, or terra nullius. And it's not in those settler colonial societies or states to really open that up and start questioning what is the legitimacy of their title. It's been found that like one of the major impediments to implementation has been looking at title, and and without the doctrine of discovery, which should be, in my opinion, declared legally invalid and morally unjust, because it's a legal fiction that the land was empty, or that Indigenous people in this part of the world didn't have laws, or an idea of ownership or nationality, because they definitely did. Borders were defined, and they were negotiated, and through whatever that looked like through 15,000 years. But resources were allocated, and there was models of diplomacy among the Mi'kmaq, with as evidenced by our Wabanaki Confederacy with neighboring nations. And we know that there was wars fought over what those borders look like and establish it. So to get at the point, terra nullius, or the doctrine of discovery, is a legal fiction, I think declared morally unjust and legally invalid. Why those nations, those settler colonial states, were so hesitant to pick or to adopt it is because they would have to look at their legitimacy. And that opens up a lot of questions about justice, restitution, what any kind of settlements, and human rights violations that those states are not prepared to look at the moment. It was policy for a long time to remove, at the time, what the policy said, Indians from their lands, and disrupt cultural transmissions and undermine and delegitimize our claim to any lands, waters, or resources. So what does that look like today, and how does it change things? Having to question the ideology and mythologies that legislation and policy in Canada as it exists today is going to be a big one. Legal tests are still being determined, and we don't know what the full impact of the declaration will be just yet. But what it means for project management, and how we do natural resource management in Canada today, I think the biggest one is looking at jurisdiction, co-management, and reevaluating the connection between colonialism and capitalism, and what sustainable management looks like.
So yeah, I think since our last meeting, there's been the issue with Cowichan out on the West Coast, and that's raised some big questions. And there's been a lot of misinformation circulating around that, but it certainly brought the subject to the forefront of mainstream Canada about where this is all coming from. So so in that light, from your experience, one of the biggest challenges lies in this disconnect between the federal and provincial jurisdiction. So you have here over in BC saying, okay, we're going to make this rule that this land is the property of the Cowichan Band, and now you're going to have to figure that out. They don't say what that means. They just say you need to figure that out. So now you have a provincial jurisdiction and you have the federal jurisdiction coming into play. So I'm sure First Nations are kind of throwing their hands up and going, oh my God, how's this all going to work? So how can nations and partners navigate this total misalignment to ensure that free, prior, and informed consent is genuinely implemented rather than symbolic? And I think that's been your focus in your studies is that specific component of UNDRIP, the free, prior, informed consent one, rather than the whole bringing up the whole doctrine of discovery issue and all of its baggage that it brings with it.
So you hit the point on the head there. You captured it perfectly, Greg, is the jurisdictional gray area and the proverbial hot potato that the federal and provincial orders of government have been playing with Indigenous people in this country. It's whose responsibility is it? Who has the fiduciary duty and responsibility to implement UNDRIP as it's been implemented? And then it changes depending on where it's being applied. So in 2024, I was fortunate enough to be accepted into the Public Policy Forum's Action Canada Fellowship. So one of the coolest things about that experience is that they've made space and had a cohort of all Indigenous fellows were part of the same group, so that we didn't, the logic being we wouldn't have to advocate for an Indigenous space, that we could just focus on what that looks like for us. Our challenge for that year was looking at policies that improve or evaluate what does the future of the natural resources sector in Canada look like. It was within a day we all agreed with UNDRIP being adopted federally, looking at natural resources, which are under the jurisdiction of provinces. How does this line up? Like, is there an alignment? Are they on the same page, or is this completely symbolic? So with the Natural Resources Acts going back a century now, the provinces having that jurisdiction and control over that. When a federal law is adopted, does it apply to the provinces writ large? That was our big question. And all the experts that we talked to kind of looked at us the same way, and we're like, we don't know yet. We're still waiting for case law to come down and determine that. But what it looks like is that no, federal laws as they're adopted don't necessarily apply automatically or obviously to provinces and territories, which is why and good for BC to get in front and have their own provincial act recognizing and adopting the declaration, regardless of what Canada did. The only other jurisdiction is the Northwest Territories that have done that. So in our policy research, what we're finding is that when it comes to the jurisdiction of natural resources, they're with the province. It's only FPIC, as it's outlined in the declaration, is only applicable and only has like teeth, I guess, or where it has to be considered legally. It has to be considered now. It's part of federal law when there's like tripartite agreement or one of the federal departments is a partner on the project. Without them, the provinces aren't bound to interpreting or having to consider FPIC, and it's more of an aspirational document until then.
Mm-hmm. So that certainly leaves a lot of gray areas for sure. But it does bring clarity around, if there's a federal partner involved in the project, then it does come into play. And if there's not, then it's kind of just an aspirational.
Yeah, it's status quo, and UNDRIP is treated as aspirational. Whereas with a federal partner, interpreting the declaration or having to consider the declaration becomes the basement, not the ceiling. So it's no longer aspiration, it is law.
So the big push would be to get the provinces to adopt UNDRIP.
That's I've been asking everyone to repeat that and to write their
Okay, well, I'll
provincial.
repeat it again. It's important that
Yeah,
the provinces adopt UNDRIP and that the pressure is put on at the provincial level. So for Ontario, it's putting pressure on Mr. Ford that if he wants the Ring of Fire, he better sign on to UNDRIP, something like that. Yes.
exactly. Thank you,
Okay.
Greg.
Step to the plate. Okay. So, this free, prior, and informed consent refers on real collaboration, trust. From your experience, how do strong projects, stakeholder relationships with communities and partners help projects move forward in a good way?
Mhm.
Keeping in mind that good stakeholder management is free, prior, informed consent, just with a different name.
Exactly. So making those connections and building those relationships, regardless of the outcome of the project, has been the number one like best practice. So all the resources um, that we've encountered and we've been researching, and there's plenty on the United Nations site that are looking and taking a global perspective because it's such a broad application. Like there's so many diverse Indigenous nations and cultures in the world that there's never going to be a one size fits all. There's best practices, but having to adopt and adapt, having to adapt to the local culture and governance structures is key. So going in with an open mind, I think it is number one. Recognizing that there is a historical injustice and tackling that head on, I think is key. Coming with an equality framework, like equality is what we're striving for. But when we come to the meeting table, think like disregarding that historical injustice of what might be, or making assumptions that just puts everything back quite a bit. It delays everything of having to catch up, and there's cultural sensitivity training that's going to take place after the fact. So doing that ahead of time, having the open mind of like it's not what worked in one nation for one project in a field, it might not apply for that exact same nation in another field. So what worked for a mining project might not work for fisheries co-management, for example, or looking at transformation or sectoral self-government. Say it's it has to be treated as novel and new every time, and building those relationships with no end goal in mind. So being prepared for that no, that's a big one. So there are plenty of great resources. The University of Colorado Boulder campus, like if you look at their site, they have a operationalizing FPIC document that I recommend to everyone who's looking to build those relationships, but being open that it's going to look different across sectors, it's going to look different across nations, and putting in the investment to build the relationship and establish trust regardless of the outcome is key. Building capacity and then opening up new models. It, the extractive practices of the past are not sustainable. So we're going to have to rethink how are we doing this? What is our end goal in mind? And putting social justice at the forefront, I think is a welcome lens that's long overdue.
Yeah, I think some companies, some provinces, they take different perspectives on this. Obviously, BC is doing a good job and kind of leading the way. But then we have scenarios in like here in Ontario where you have the Ford government with ads about how the Ring of Fire is going to bring jobs and to Ontario and critical minerals that are needed globally. And, there's no reference to, there's a long road to hoe yet in negotiations with First Nations in the northern Ontario. And, his approach is kind of like, well, just ramrod it through. And, our prime minister is talking that language. And yet I don't think I don't think either of them have acknowledged the elephant in the room, which is that they have to negotiate with First Nations, over particularly in Ontario because of treaties. And this is where the free, prior, informed consent really comes into play, is saying, well, you can't start the project and then start consulting with us. We need to be consulted at the front end, and we want to be able to give consent to this project. And we also have the right to not give consent to the project. It's not a done deal, as would be implied by Mr. Ford or Mr. Carney, that this is a done deal. We're just going to negotiate with the local First Nations, and we're moving forward. So I think that's so. How could First Nations in, let's say, Ontario leverage free, prior, informed consent? Is that a banner they can get up there and wave? Because they could say, well, the Ring of Fire province would say, well, this is a provincial project.
Yeah.
What would your personal
Yes.
opinion on that be?
So my opinion on that, and acknowledging the elephant in the room, like, so not just premiers that are mentioned, but Bill C5, which has come through so quickly in light of new geopolitical relationships and developments globally. It does not adequately take FPIC into consideration. Like, this is well known, and leadership across the country has been voicing and expressing their protest and their dissatisfaction with how the federal and provincial governments have been rolling out new legislation with respect to explorations and extractions and trade. And there's been a long-standing attitude and stance on that, and that's nothing about us without us. And addressing the elephant in the room being the land acknowledgements that we're all encouraged to say about whose traditional territory is this. What does it mean to have unceded territory? What legally, the Declaration has a lot of very beautiful sounding words strung together, but if our partners are not going to walk the walk, that's all that they remain. And the attitude when we did our engagement here in Nova Scotia with our member nations on what is their thoughts about UNDRIP being implemented and into federal law, and how do we make sure that federal laws are in aligned with the Declaration itself. The majority of people that we talked to were extremely skeptical. Their attitude was essentially, if this goes forward, what are we going to lose? So the socialization around that of the mistrust with government, the attitude isn't what do we have to gain? It's always what do we have to lose? Like, what is being taken away from us here, cloak and dagger? So fundamentally there is something really broken about this relationship. So my personal opinion on how to use this, I think looking for all the recourse we can, looking for the partnerships we can, but at the same time, we've seen what happens when free, prior, informed consent is not obtained. And you don't have to look far to see some very high profile conflicts being in Standing Rock in the United States. The Coastal GasLink pipeline is another one. More locally, Elsipogtog First Nation with SWN and fracking explorations. And then even looking back a little further, the Oka confrontation that happened in Ganawagi and Ganasatagi all could have been avoided with obtaining free, prior, and informed consent. So looking at those engagements that took place in 2022, and from the Assembly of First Nations voicing the opinions and what the priorities are for Indigenous people in Canada with this legislation going through. Canada released, Justice released their action plan for implementation. And a lot of the language was status quo, and it was a lot of continue to support blank. And our reaction to that has been for an action plan. There's not a whole lot of planned action. It's more or less Canada's taking the stance of status quo, but saying they're going to do one thing and then doing another.
Yeah. So, in project management, like stakeholder management is a part of project management. It's one of the knowledge areas in project management. And, I've always said that, if you're not managing your stakeholders, you're not managing the project. And if First Nations are a major stakeholder, you're setting yourself up for significant risk of the project being stopped, of complications happening. That, I think industry just needs a set of standard rules to follow. And I think some industries are much more cooperative than others, and companies within those industries can be much more, admitting the elephant in the room and saying, well, look, let's do this the proper way. And knowing from circumstance and evidence over time that it ends up being a better result, or it turns out to be an ugly result. So without that, acknowledgement, you could always say, well, where is your stakeholder management? If this is such a big project, we want to see and we're a major stakeholder, how are you engaging us with the concepts of free, prior, and informed consent? And, maybe it's a full page ad in the Toronto Star, every week for the next 6 weeks or 6 months, saying, we're here. This is what UNDRIP is. I don't think Canadians have a clue about what UNDRIP is. I don't think they have a clue what FPIC is. I don't think they've ever heard of the doctrine of discovery. And if they did, they'd probably be horrified. And, so maybe it's a big PR campaign that says, and that might drive the politicians to maybe stepping forward and saying, okay, we have to acknowledge the elephant in the room. Right now, most Canadians don't even know the elephant's in the room. And, governments, federal and provincial, are just kind of, as you say, status quo, walking the same line, but it's gonna end up with the same issues, same results.
Nothing changes if nothing changes.
Exactly. And so this has been wonderful, Tyler, to give us some insights into what was the other organization you mentioned that you were working with earlier on, the policy development? I'm just wondering, what resources do other First Nations have to leverage this if they're in a situation where they've got a big project going on, and who do I contact to help me raise this international law and bring it into play?
Yeah, so that's always been the question of like, our nations in this part of the world, First Nations in Canada, have an education experience that's unique. Not just with problem solving in general, but like looking at and evaluating legal precedent and Canadian law and navigating jurisdictional gray areas and adapting to changing circumstances, like in projects. As you've taught our group, when the project scope changes, what does that mean for everyone? So locating the resources, our people, for the most part, are faced with poverty even today. Canada is one of the by any measure, quality of life in Canada internationally consistently ranks in the top 10. In my research, when I was doing my graduate work, if you isolate those factors and apply them to on reserve for status Indians in this country, the living conditions consistently come out in ranked in the 50s and 60s, more comparable to Mexico or Brazil. So what is the explanation for that socio-political or socioeconomic gap or disparity? Comes down to the success, like when we're looking at capitalistic systems, especially settler colonialisms, where it was extracted from one group, there was often an unjust taking. So we are still managing the fallout of centuries of unequal distribution of power and resource management. So we have a lot of expertise going back millennia, and a lot of projects would benefit from adopting and implementing local Indigenous ecological knowledge and local Indigenous traditional knowledge. Why we're not able to is the resources that we do have are so limited, and we're having to put out fires of the daily of people responding to intergenerational trauma. The emergency of the day might not be a PR campaign on FPIC. It might be saving the life of your neighbor. It might be keeping your operations and your administration flowing for day to day, or coming together as a community when needed. So accessing those resources, we've unfortunately been in what's called a despotic relationship with federal government, or how it's described otherwise as a walk-along government. So having to mimic and do like federal government and how they manage things. So with limited resources and being made to be reliant on limited funding pots that we have to compete with one another, it's created what's called crab bucket syndrome, where crabs aren't able to leave the bucket without being pulled in by the others. Created infighting that's unnecessary, and having to reprioritize and put out the fire of the day rather than think long term and act long term.
And dealing with these bigger issues. Yeah.
Exactly.
And there's a role that Assembly of First Nations should really be taking on in financing, if it's coming down to a full page ad in the Toronto Star or something like that.
So the resources, to answer your question, so the UnitedNations.org has a lot of great free resources. The University of Colorado Boulder campus has a really great operationalizing guide, and the fellowship that I was named to in 2024 and 25 is the Public Policy Forums Action Canada Fellowship, and that research paper and policy recommendations are available on their site.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Tyler. And I'd really like to open up I've been hogging all the opportunity to ask you questions. I'd like to open it up to our audience here. So let's see what kind of questions we've got coming in from everybody else.
I do have a couple of things before we go to the question section. And Tyler, if you don't mind, I will ask you to come back on screen in a few minutes. Just a few things coming up, and let me share my screen. Thank you, Tyler, so much for sharing your knowledge and for sharing the resources. So just before we go on to the Q&A segment of today, a few things coming up. So with the holiday season soon approaching, we will be returning with this amazing webinar series and amazing new speakers in February 2026. And it is going to be something very exciting. I'm just gonna put this in full screen. so that you can see and take a scan to register. It's going to be an very interesting topic, and one of the things that we did hear Tyler say was about building continuity and capacity. So ENVPMS is entering into a new chapter, and that's going to reflect a lot of the lessons that we've all learned, whether it's through the webinar, through working with different communities. And we know that at the heart of it all is something called the 3 C's, which is how do we build capacity? How do we ensure continuity? And how do we strengthen our communities? So that's what we're going to be talking about in Feb 2026. So please don't miss this opportunity. We'd love to have you register from now. We will be sending frequent reminders closer to the date, but get your seat in as soon as possible. Miriam, our colleague, is also going to be sharing a link if you're unable to scan. And as we also talk about what is coming up in 2026, one thing that we found very important, and Greg also spoke about, is the importance of understanding what challenges the communities face, whether it's stakeholder management or procurement, etc. So we would love to get your 2 cents on what are some of the biggest challenges that you've had. This kind of polling will help us create more topics, whether it's trainings, workshops, or amazing webinar series like this. So please, if you can take a few moments and scan the QR code to just share your thoughts. And I promise you, we will be going to the Q&A very soon. I'm just going to leave it here for a few seconds. All right. You will also find the link to answer this question. And if there are any topics that you are interested in hearing more of in the next phase of this webinar series, please feel free to also share that in the chat. All right. What I will do right now is I am going to hand over the baton to Wahida, who will take us through some questions. Wahida, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Tyler. That was so amazing. Your knowledge and your passion, it is so transparent. I just love the passion you displayed, and thank you so much. Thank you for showing up and doing this amazing work that you're doing. And Greg, thank you too for providing this series all year long. 6, as you mentioned, our final one of 2025. You've been instrumental creating these webinars it's just been an amazing series. So grateful that I was a part of this. Thank you. Thank you so much. And stories too. Done an amazing job getting this information out there. So I just wanted to say that as the final webinar of the year. So Tyler, I have one question so far. It came in from Ty, and I don't know, Ty, if you'd like to unmute yourself. It's public policy forums and question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark. I don't know if that was a chat question or a question for Tyler. If you'd like to unmute yourself, please feel free to unmute yourself. We can delve into this a little bit more.
Hello, Wache. Yeah, no, I missed the reference. Tyler was providing some references of how to allocate some support in terms of the challenges regarding acknowledging UNDRIP with federal jurisdictions and the regulatory bodies, specifically working with corporations. And I don't feel like the question was quite answered properly because there's so much context and so much information. But as Greg was suggesting, when trying to get the provincial regulators, ministries, or the corporations to acknowledge UNDRIP, and obviously I'm speaking from Ontario, where are the tools, or who would we seek out for support in recognizing that, other than obviously a law firm, which is just, you know, another abundant amount of money that we might not have, especially with so many projects ongoing simultaneously. So I am here with a pen ready to go. Just policy forums. There was a group there that we could possibly make use of. And if you have any more advice in that regard, it'd be appreciated. Shimi Witch.
Definitely. Thank you, Ty, for that. Definitely. So I was referring to the Public Policy Forum. It's a public think tank in Canada. The Action Canada Fellowship is what I participated in 2024-25 to do that research. So that was where that sponsorship came from to do that. But the resources itself, I would say University of Colorado Boulder has an operationalizing FPIC guideline. The United Nations .org has a lot of free resources. But again, it's doing that work yourself and then having like a law firm interpret it. That's the issue. So again, Assembly of First Nations, if you can make contact there, like that is their mandate for advocacy. Local tribal councils is always a thing, but like Public Policy Forum and Conference Board of Canada are public think tanks that may be able to take that on for you free of charge, or form some kind of partnership or sponsorship to do the research.
Tyler, have you had any experience with the Canadian Quakers? I put it in the chat. They have their Canadian Friends Service Committee. When I've seen presentations at AFN, they often had their lawyers speaking about UNDRIP. So, Ty, that might be a source of some legal support. They're out of Winnipeg. Did we lose Ty? I saw you had another question.
Yeah, forgive me for chiming in twice. I know there's a lot of people here in limited time. I just wanted to give possibly some notion to everybody that is on the call. It is a difficult battle. I work as the Mineral Development Advisor, focused mostly with the Ministry of Mines and Mining Development in our territory. I found it useful to be cordial with everybody in the industry. After all, it's the corporations at the executive level that are the issue. The people that you encounter all have jobs. They're just trying to keep their jobs and keep food and the heat on for themselves. So I found other than the odd person who's a company man and there's just no getting through, I will say that. But for the most part, I've been useful and informed by being non-confrontational, kind of listening to facts. But to Tyler's point, using your traditional ecological knowledge, your traditional knowledge, case in point, discovering that your area is full of archaeological, not sites. I like to use the terminology landscapes, because this way we've been able to point out historical trade routes, which have become protective mechanisms under ecological corridor protection. This is how we've been kind of pushing back locally against corporate encroachment, both mining, forestry, and other. But I find UNDRIP and the United Nations being very difficult to get anybody to acknowledge. I have learned now that it's about the difference between the feds and the province, which I've heard before, but it's nice to hear it reiterated here. And I find it very challenging because many of the people who sit at the United Nations, even though the United Nations is built on things such as, freedom of, humanitarian rights, freedom of speech, and so forth, many of the people who sit on the table at the United Nations, their people are limited. They are under authoritarian rule and do not have the freedom of speech. So even though United Nations speaks to this as a great avenue and a fantasy, many of the countries that sit there are still suppressing their people forcefully. And so to what degree can we really trust in UNDRIP? So I would say trust in knowledge passed down by your ancestors, your elders, and build collaboration. One of the other comments was crab in a bucket. It's better to go at these corporations collaboratively with other sister nations where your traditional territory is overlapping, because to go at it alone is a very lone wolf scenario, and they don't see necessarily the imperativeness to have any resolve with you. But when you can find collaboration between your nations, and it's difficult because you have multiple electoral bodies, all with their own opinions and all that power struggle. But if you can work together, and I've kind of avoided the political aspect. I've just worked with other MDAs and other First Nations, as well as other environmental lands and resource departments. This is what we've done to unify ourselves to be more of a wolf pack versus lone wolf. and it's working to some degree. But I just have learned not to put too much trust in the United Nations, but put the power of the results in your own work plan, and kind of hold on and brace for cover. But thank you for hearing me, Jimmy Gwetch. I'll digress.
Miigwech,
Tyler,
Ty?
any final thoughts? Do we have any more questions, Wahida?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Thank you, Ty. Thank you, Ty, for sharing all of that. Miigwech for your shares. So we have another. Can UNDRIP help when negotiating SFLs within forestry, from Bree? Bree, would you like to come on?
Excuse me. I guess my question is like sustainable forest licenses that, there's normally a 10-year plan. Does UNDRIP have any influence within the forestry sector? Or are we still playing with the province sort of thing?
Yeah, I think it would be the latter. I'm not too familiar with the forest industry and what that looks like, but based on meetings last week with the Canadian Institute on Engagement and Consultation, we're still figuring out like what the implications are of passing UNDRIP federally in federal laws, and then defining and figuring out what the recourse looks like, or what's the teeth of enforcement. We really it's very unclear at this point. And what we've also been finding is another roadblock that's been coming up that we really didn't anticipate is if a province declares emergency orders, they can circumvent consultation and obtaining free, prior, informed consent before the project, and they can go forward and proceed, and then commit to fixing it after the fact. So I would be very aware of what constitutes those emergency orders, and then as Ty was outlining, I think building those relationships with traditional, modern and traditional governing structures of the nation, and asserting the right, I think, without permission. Don't ask for the endorsement, just go forward.
Perfect.
Sounds like good advice.
Mhm.
Damn the torpedoes.
Thank you, Bree.
But as you say, it's going to revert to to battle lines by the sound of it, and it seems that the old strategies are the only strategies that are still available, especially on provincial projects that don't have any federal jurisdiction. So it's at
I
least
guess
good
just to add to my follow-up, my only conundrum with that is that traditional territory is within federal lands, correct? So then how are provincial companies and laws and regulations implemented within traditional territory, especially when it comes to forestry?
Yeah, and I think
There's so many loopholes that need to be resolved still, and
yeah, and that's that jurisdictional gray area of the territory might be federal land, but the mandate for the resources on the land might be provincial, and it's sometimes bringing both orders of government to the table and just saying someone's got to answer to this. I know it's not successful or preferred in all territories, but some nations have had success with tripartite meetings, and others as different bilateral meetings. But yeah, I totally get where you're coming from. It's just another hoop to jump through sometimes.
So maybe the negotiating tactic is to say, well, there's two ways we can approach this. We can approach it from the courts, and your project's going to get tied up in the courts for 10, 15 years, or you can show up at the table and negotiate in good faith, and we should be able to get this done in a couple of years. So I think that's the leverage. Because I guess on the other hand, the gray area is also to the advantage of the First Nations because it is gray. It's not cut and dry. So, you know, I don't think companies want to go to the table and invest billions of dollars in a project on, you know, on that kind of wiggle room or gray area around the project that this may or may not proceed. If I'm an investor, I'm going to say, well, I'm going to hands off on that. And I would imagine there's a lot of investors that are going to walk because the First Nations isn't signing on, knowing full well that what may come down the pipe at the legal in the legal realm in 5 or 10 or 15 years could shut them down. You know, most of these mining projects, you know, they're looking at 50, 60-year windows. So just flip the coin. It could be advantageous to have that gray area as well, because there's no decision is no decision, right? It is a decision.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Tyler, I know that you've shared a lot during this webinar. Are there 3 key takeaways that you'd like to offer to the audience today?
The big one that we didn't talk about is, and I'm consistently questioned on this, is FPIC a veto? And just to let everyone know, like that question, that attitude of thinking came about like with the Harper era. All it reveals is that Canada is not prepared to deal with a no or any nation withholding consent. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a veto. It just means that there was an assumption that a yes would be obtained. So not a veto going forward. And other areas, like I think the consideration of what happens when consent isn't obtained, looking to those examples like Standing Rock or Coastal GasLink or Oka confrontations. It's in everyone's best interest to be on the same page ahead of time. You know, nations aren't opposed to development, but it can't come at the expense of marginalizing community or further perpetuating historical injustice. And the other piece being, the jurisdictional gray area that we're still figuring out. If anyone, when we find a solution, working together and sharing resources, I think is key, and reconceptualizing development and what that means long term. So looking at the impacts of extractive resources, and maybe we have to rethink what sustainability is and how it's achieved.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take one final question from Jim Taggart. Jim, would you like to unmute yourself?
Merci, Joe. Just, there's been lots of talk about the legal aspects of this and the fact that there's not been any kind of one key fundamental court case. And I was just wondering if we do need a united front from all First Nations across Canada to really get a decision on this, and particularly on UNDRIP, or whether it's better focusing on one specific case to have kind of set case law and set precedents on this. Yukon First Nations, the vast majority of them have final agreements that surpass even the rights within UNDRIP, and we are still having huge issues with those rights being acknowledged, particularly by the Yukon territorial government. And I'm just wondering if you feel it really does need a court decision to make a final decision on this. See, Joe?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I totally get it. And that sounds like a really pragmatic solution, is to just put it on the Canadian court. At the same time, that perpetuates the colonial relationship of power sitting with the Supreme Court of Canada. I would want to reframe it so that maybe it's the revitalization of Indigenous or Indigenous nations legal orders, and having that united front locally. In our territory, it may be bringing back our traditional Grand Council and having the revitalization of a Wabanaki Confederacy, which includes Wolastoqey, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy nations, along with the Mi'kmaq.
Great, thank you so much. And I know this is being a little interactive at the end, so let's invite Ty on one final time. Ty, what would you like to share? What would you like to add to this conversation?
Hello. Some ideas that I've been working through kind of came up with just listening to the discussion. One of them is it's important that not only us as technicians, workers, policymakers within our governing bodies, we need to be able to explain to our leaderships in each council the corporate language that is being used between governments and corporations internationally. And this new use, these new tools, so many of you may be familiar with ESG, the environmental, social, and governing grading system. This is also coming apparent now in just normal society, day-to-day social credit scores. This is how we're kind of being able to digitally track the progress for corporations and governments, an important tool, because as they're trying to raise money for all these projects, if your ESG score is low, it demonstrates to an investor that they don't have possibly the right guidelines or the right policies to prove successful, and so your investment is likely to fail and what have you. Now, if they're scrutinizing so carefully what an ESG score is or how good you're managing your carbon output and so forth, I think it's important, and I did put something in the chat. It's about NGOs and communities. IRMA, this is the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. This has been a very helpful guideline because it allows me to speak with locals in Canada about international standards, which have raised the bar even beyond those. There are a lot of countries, their standards might be pretty low, but international standards, as recognized by UNDRIP and the United Nations, need to be kind of honored. It could be used as a bit of leverage. But with that being said, I've noticed that many Indigenous communities are faced with having to keep their mouths very close knit for the political ambitions to each one of their councils. So it would be very effective to do a PR campaign on social media, bringing up the names of the companies, demonstrating, because then you could quickly get international interest, and investors would have to recognize that we're not doing something. This is getting out of line. Fix this, because trying to manage it formally through email correspondence, mutual meetings, discussions, it only gets so far. It's not until you get a squeaky wheel, and this can be done on an international level. But I feel like the political bodies ourselves, even the one I managed under, is very limited in what I can say, what numbers I can say. And when it's up to leadership to actually do that, they not necessarily have the skills as technicians do to advocate, and through PR. And so I'm not sure if there's been any really great examples of continued PR, but we do have the tools to our disposal. And maybe you want to take that back to your communities and actually really find a pattern to where you can bring these arguments up in a public setting and then put these corporations on point, because without that, everything just kind of gets hushed in an email folder and nothing gets released to the public, which would actually invoke proper change. I digress. Thank you for that third opportunity.
Thank you, Ty. That was so informative. I appreciate that, and I'm sure everyone's appreciated all of your feedback during this webinar. We've had the two Ty and Tyler's just leading sharing some wonderful information today. So I am going to, Miigwech, once again, Tyler, for showing up here today and giving up your time so freely and your knowledge, and to Greg. And I'll pass back over to you, Greg.
Okay, well, just a final thank you there, Tyler, and to our attendees for participating in today's event and bringing this series to life. It's, I think, last count, we were up to over the series of 6 webinars. We've had over 700 attendees. So I'd like to just say to all of those folks out there, thanks for participating in our webinar series, and look forward to seeing you all in our next webinar. So stay tuned. It's coming up February 24th. We're going to have a big announcement to make about environmental project management solutions. We're going to lead up over the next couple of months to what this announcement's going to be. So I'm not going to give it away today, but so stay tuned, and we'll be introducing it in this webinar in February. And we're looking at a different aspect of running kind of almost a panel type approach to the webinar. So sign up if you'd like. That way you're registered and you've got a seat. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now. See you in February.